Hello and welcome to part 5 of this video series. Today I'm going to be explaining every reference in chapter 5 of Donna Tartt's book, The Secret History. This is a long chapter. It's also quite a good chapter though, because you get to see a lot of the dramatic tension that has been built up actually come to a head in this chapter. And this is also a very reference-heavy chapter. We get the first bit of explanation at the start of it about Henry and Bunny's trip to Rome, and that in itself ends up having just a lot of locations that are referenced. And then we also have a fair amount of Julian backstory, and that is really rife with references to people that he used to know. And then in between, we have all the classic stuff that Donna likes throwing in, references to old authors, references to old art, and all the other fun, obscure stuff. So without further ado, let's get on into this chapter. Starting us off for chapter 5 on page 173, Henry drops some Latin on us saying, "Deprende miserum est," and this translates to, "It is wretched to be found out." Then on page 175, Camilla gets involved in the French. After being unable to speak for several days due to the bacchanalia, she says, "Je me sens comme Helen Keller mon vieux," which translates to, "I feel like Helen Keller, old man." Helen Keller famously was an American author and disability activist, and she famously lost her sight and her hearing at a very young age. On page 177, while Frances and Henry express concern about Bunny's knowledge of the murder, Frances says that he's just the sort who always stands up in the back of the courtroom during the last 5 minutes of Perry Mason. Perry Mason was a legal drama that ran in the 60s and 70s. Then on page 178, we hear that Richard and Bunny had been watching the 39 Steps the same night that the others had gone and performed the ceremony. And the 39 Steps is a political thriller and action movie based on a book of the same name. It's been adapted several times, but most famously by Alfred Hitchcock, which is the version that Bunny and Richard were going and seeing. And again, we see Bunny and Richard going off and experiencing some pop culture, while the others are going off and performing Greek rituals in the woods, so there's a bit of a divide in the group. Then on page 180, Frances says they weren't too concerned when Bunny found the group covered in blood, because it wasn't like we thought we were doing this in front of J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover was the first director of the FBI, so both they're saying, they didn't think Bunny is that smart and was going to catch on, but also it's not like Bunny's the cops, Bunny is supposed to be their friend, but as we see, that doesn't quite pan out like they thought. On page 183, Bunny says, "Kairai, Deerslayers." Kairai is just a Greek greeting. It's like a way of saying hello. Also on page 183, Bunny asks the group, "Feeling queasy bak choy," which means feeling queasy initiates. And they are initiates because they have performed this Greek ceremony. On page 187, we get a reference to the Piazza di Spagna. That's a piazza in Rome. Henry also mentions the Grand Hotel, but there are a lot of Grand Hotels in Rome, so I'm not really sure which one he means, but he seems to think that there's one specific one that would be obvious, but not sure which one that is. On page 188, Henry says, "We were living just a few steps from the Via Condotti, the most expensive shopping street in Rome." This is what that looks like. I think that's just pretty self-explanatory. But when I was reading the book, I didn't want to go through and look up pictures of all these places that Henry mentions, so just putting some here. On page 191, Henry says he sort of dunked around. This is a bit hard to find a translation for. He seems to be pretty much saying that he so-so'd around, didn't do much. And Henry is now using Italian, so he's really showing off his linguistic ability. And he's doing this in front of Richard, who he definitely knows doesn't speak Italian, and I think serves as one of the many ways that Henry kind of intellectually intimidates Richard. And I think this is intentional. On page 192, we get 2 more location names dropped. I'll have pictures up of them, but I don't feel the need to give their specific names here. On page 193, Henry checks into the Excelsior, which is a fancy hotel in Rome. Also on page 193, Henry complains that it was impossible to write a letter or even to make a telephone call without Bunny lurking somewhere in the background, erectus auribus. Erectus auribus translates to attentively or with his ears peeled, and it is Latin. On page 194, when Henry talks about their plan to run away from school to avoid Bunny, he says that we'd have to devise a plan, probably a rather Pyrrhic and unsatisfactory one. A Pyrrhic victory is a phrase you might have heard before, and it's a victory in which although you win, the cost of the win is so high that it might as well be considered a loss. This phrase comes from the Greek king Pyrrhus of Epirus, and he won 2 battles against the Romans in 280 and 279 BC, but he sustained such heavy losses from those battles that he had to suspend his campaign against the Romans. On page 197, when they're talking about the farmer that they killed, Francis says, "This man was not Voltaire we killed." Voltaire was a French Enlightenment writer. He was a philosopher, satirist, and historian, a very revered intellectual figure. Also on page 197, we get some French from Francis, which translates to sleep rather than live, and then a sentence from Henry, which translates to in a sleep as sweet as death. Henry and Francis are quoting a poem here called Flowers of Evil, which was written by Charles Baudelaire, and Francis says like one line, and then Henry, just like that, picks up onto the next verse. So either this is something they knew together, or Henry just really knows his stuff. On page 198, Richard mentally compares Henry to Tojo at the height of the war, forcing his top aides to sit up and play cards with him all night long. This is referring to Hideki Tojo, who was the prime minister and a general of Japan during World War II. I can't find any specific stories about him making people play cards with him late at night, but I always trust Richard. Richard would never lie about anything. On page 199, the class is assigned to write an essay on any epigram of Callimachus that we chose. Callimachus was an ancient Greek poet and scholar. He was active in Alexandria during the 3rd century BC, and his works are known for dealing with small-scale topics over like large, epic, prominent ones. On page 200, Richard gives different words for fire in Latin, French, and then Greek, respectively. And then continuing on that page, talking about the Greek view of fire, Richard describes that inhuman purr that the Greeks knew, that purr that roared from the towers of Ilion or leapt and screamed on that desolate windy beach from the funeral pyre of Patroclus. Ilion is the Greek term for Troy, which was burned, so that's why he's referencing it here. And Patroclus, or Patrocles, was what historians call a good friend of Achilles. He was an important character in the Iliad, and he died during the Trojan War, and after his death, his body was cremated, so that's the funeral pyre that we're talking about. Continuing on page 200, when Richard is talking about the inability of English to express his thoughts about Greek, he says, "It is the tongue of Ahab and Falstaff and Mrs. Gamp." Ahab is the captain in Moby Dick, which is the Herman Melville novel. Falstaff is Sir John Falstaff. He's a character in a couple of Shakespeare plays. He's in Henry IV, Part 1 and 2. He's in the Merry Wives of Windsor, and he's mentioned in Henry V. And Mrs. Gamp is an alcoholic midwife in the Charles Dickens novel Martin Chuzzlewit. I don't know why he chose Mrs. Gamp as one of the examples. I don't think she's like a particularly beloved Dickens character, but maybe he's just trying to get like a full range of people who speak English in fictional settings. Like maybe she's a little lower class than Ahab and Falstaff. On page 202, we hear that Camilla wrote her paper on Callimachus's epigram 14. The epigram goes, "If thou goest to Cyzicus, it will be small trouble to find Hippicus and Didyme, for not obscure is their family. And a painful message thou wilt tell them, yet tell them this, that I here cover Critias, their son." And obviously this refers to the death of a family son, which foreshadows the fate of Bunny. We also hear reference to the epigram that Charles picked. I can't find specifically which one this is though. I've heard some people suggest that it is epigram 22, but that's the one that Richard did, so unless they both did the same one, I mean, I guess they could have, but I'm just not sure. And I didn't feel the need to explain Richard's epigram because he translates it for us, and you can get whatever meaning you want out of that one. Also on page 202, we get a French/European location dump as Bunny describes a trip that he's planned out for the summer that Henry is going to be paying for. He says they're going to begin in Champagne country and then went via hot air balloon to Burgundy for more bargaining, through Beaujolais to the Riviera and Cannes and Monte Carlo. On page 207, we see an inscription on Camilla's bracelet which reads, "Blown hair is sweet, brown hair over the mouth blown." And this is a quotation from who else but T.S. Eliot, back again. It's from his poem Ash Wednesday, and this is a poem which touches on themes of struggling with faith and the guilt those feelings can cause. On page 208, in response to Camilla saying that she likes the mountains better than the seashore, Henry says, "So do I. I suppose in that regard my tastes are rather Hellenistic. Landlocked places interest me. I've never had the slightest bit of interest in the sea." Rather like what Homer says about the Arcadians, you remember? With ships they had nothing to do. I can't find an exact match for the Homer quote, but it seems to be from around book 2 in the Iliad. Agamemnon wanted to bring the Arcadians with him because they were good soldiers, but they didn't use ships, so he used his own ships to bring them over. This quote is a bit confusing in its wording. What he's really saying is they had nothing to do with boats, like they weren't affiliated or associated with them, not that they had boats and they weren't sure what to do with them. Maybe that confusion is just me though, but I didn't get that the first time I read that. And then as for Henry saying that maybe he's Hellenistic because he cares for the land more than the sea, I'm not quite sure on this one. The Hellenistic period of Greece was from around 300 BCE to just the turn of the current era. I think it's in particular when Cleopatra lost power in Egypt. And I don't know why this would mean that he doesn't like the ocean. Perhaps Greece just wasn't as renowned for its naval power at that time, but I'm not sure. This one didn't quite make sense to me. On page 208, we get a reference to Pan. He was the Greek god of the wild and of nature. Henry also starts quoting Callimachus's hymn to Zeus, which goes, "In Parrhasia it was that Rhea bore thee, where was a hill sheltered with the thickest brush." On page 209, the Red Sox are referred to. And this is just for anybody who doesn't know baseball or who isn't American. The Red Sox are a baseball team that's located in Boston. On page 210, Henry asks, does anyone remember Plato's definition of justice in the Republic? The Republic is Plato's writings on what a proper government and proper individual action should look like. Also on this page, Richard says, one likes to imagine that kindly Pliny was held in affection by the poor folk of Comum and Tifernum. Pliny the Younger was a Roman historian who was born in Comum, which is a northern Italian province, and he had a villa near Tifernum. So that's why he would be associated with those people, and he would have been rich, so you like to think that this nice historian would have been beloved by the common folk. On page 220, we get the Latin phrase requiescat in pace, which means rest in peace. Then on page 221, we get some French when Bunny says, it's pretty damn peculiar, n'est-ce pas? This French translates to, is it not? On page 22, Bunny is teasing Richard and says, before I know it, you'll have hair down to your shoulders and be skulking around in rags like Howard Hughes. Hughes was a film producer, and then he was an important figure in the aviation industry. He was a billionaire, but near the end of his life, he became really erratic. He had chronic pain, and he'd also had some head injuries from a plane crash that he was in. He also had worsening OCD, and his hearing was going. And he looked pretty rough at the end of his life, and he was known to be really eccentric and hard to deal with. On page 223, we have the Latin phrase amor vincit omnia, which translates to love conquers all. On this page, we also hear about the inherent sexism in the Greek language, which Richard attributes to the Argives, who are people from the very old Greek city of Argos. On page 224, Marion is described as Bunny's raison d'etre, which means a reason for existence. Also on this page, Henry is described as too erratic and generally strange, a sort of Mycroft Holmes of classical philology. Mycroft Holmes is the older brother of Sherlock Holmes, and he's said to be even more intelligent than Sherlock. However, he has a dislike for field work, and he works for the government because he gets to sit inside all day. And Sherlock says that he has no ambition and no energy. On page 227, while riding in Judy Poovy's car, Richard says they were listening to terrible music, parentheses, Freebird. This is a song by Leonard Skinner, and it is not terrible. This is actually a reference to the fact that nobody likes Richard. Then on page 228, Richard says, I had a childlike faith in him, and as confidently as Dr. Watson observing the actions of his more illustrious friend, I waited for the design to manifest itself. This refers to John Watson, who's the companion to Sherlock Holmes. At the end of a lot of Holmes story, Sherlock Holmes kind of pulls the curtain away and explains how everything happened. And Watson just stands there and is like, oh my god, I can't believe it. And so that's how Richard sees himself. He really believes that Henry is just going to be able to make everything happen because he thinks Henry's so smart. Also on page 228, while giving himself a haircut, Richard says that the finished product was always very thistly and childlike, a la Arthur Rimbaud. Rimbaud was the first person that Richard actually quotes in the book. And if you need a reminder on what his hair looked like, it does look a little thistly and childish. On page 230, we get the Latin name for some mushrooms. I'll just put up some pictures of them and their English names with them. Then on page 231, Henry says the Borgias would have wept to see the health food store I found in Brattleboro last week. Henry's saying this because there were lots of poisonous plants at the store, and the Borgias were a Spanish noble family that was powerful during the 15th and 16th centuries, and they were suspected of poisoning their enemies. They used arsenic in particular as the allegation against them. On page 235, Henry complains about a translation of Dante's Purgatorio, which is a part of the Divine Comedy. He says that it loses all the terza rima, and terza rima is the rhyme scheme that Dante invented for the writing of the Divine Comedy, but it's very difficult to translate out of Italian, which was the original language that it was written in. On page 238, we get a reference to The Young Doctors. Francis's mom's boyfriend is in that show, apparently, and that's a soap opera that's set in a hospital, and it focuses on like the relationships of young medical workers. But this does seem to mess up the timeline a little bit, at least if this is a reference to the Australian soap opera, which is the only one I've been able to find of this name, because the last season of that show aired in 1983. However, later in the book we get a reference to Salman Rushdie in a context that makes it clear that his book, The Satanic Verses, has been published, but that book only came out in 1988, and so there's no way that Frances's mom's boyfriend would be currently in The Young Doctors, because that show would have been off the air already. So maybe Donna Tartt just made up a TV show name called The Young Doctors, and she didn't realize that it was this Australian TV show. I don't know why she would be watching Australian medical soap operas, or it's just a mistake in the timeline. On page 239, we get a bunch of name drops for people that Julian used to know in Europe, so I'm just going to go through all of them quickly. I'm not going to read off the paragraph. You can just find it and look for the context if you need. So Charles Laughton, he was a British and American actor. He was in movies such as Jamaica Inn, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and Spartacus. Then the Duchess of Windsor. Her real name was Wallis Simpson. She was an American socialite who married Prince Edward, and he was King Edward VIII at the time, but he abdicated the throne in 1936 to marry her. That's actually why Queen Elizabeth II got the throne. And he did this because Wallis Simpson was already divorced twice, and marrying her would have been scandalous to make her the queen. And then after he abdicated the throne, he became the Duke of Windsor, and that made her the Duchess of Windsor. So that's why she is the Duchess of Windsor. However, she was interestingly never given the title of Her Royal Highness. That's seen as a snub by the Queen. Gertrude Stein, she was an American novelist, poet, and playwright. She moved to Paris in 1903 when she was 29 years old, and she lived there for the rest of her life. Cyril Connolly was an English literary critic and writer. He was the editor of the influential literary magazine Horizon. Harold Acton was a British historian and the author of novels and poetry, and Sarah Murphy and her husband were American socialites who moved to the French Riviera and became known for throwing parties and creating a social circle of artists. On page 242, Giotto is referenced. Giotto de Bondone was an Italian painter and architect who was from Florence. On page 249, when reflecting on his original plan to use mushrooms to poison Bunny, Henry says it's completely ridiculous. The whole idea is like something from Sir Walter Scott. Sir Walter Scott was referenced earlier, if you remember. Francis's family house had a first edition copy of his novel Ivanhoe, and Scott wrote historical dramas that were a bit melodramatic, and so a convoluted poisoning of the type that Henry was dreaming up for Bunny would fit in well into one of his stories. On page 250, when talking about all the poisons he has looked into, Henry says, "It's too easy to beguile myself with the Medicis, the Borgias, all those poisoned rings and roses." The Medicis were a prominent banking family that also acquired massive political power. Catherine de' Medici in particular was the Queen of France and is thought to have been involved in poisoning her enemies. And then on the Borgia side, Lucrezia Borgia is associated with the use of a poison ring, which is a ring with a small compartment to hold poison that can be slipped into enemies' food or drink. On page 263, Judy Pouvet says, "I'm so out of shape, I have to start doing Jane Fonda again." Jane Fonda is an American actress who made a very popular video exercise routine.
60-minute heart-pumping regimen without the muscle and joint stress of high-impact movements.
Then on page 264, Richard describes a red-wigged lady who sat at the switchboard and knitted all weekend, paying no attention to the incoming calls. As usual, the lights were blinking frantically, and she had her back to them, as oblivious as that ill-omened wireless operator on the Californian the night the Titanic went down. This is a reference to Cyril Evans, who was the only radio operator on the Californian. The Californian is believed to be the only ship that was close enough to the Titanic to have seen its distress flares and its sinking. However, it did not come to the aid of the Titanic. But in the defense of Cyril Evans, who Richard is referencing here, he sent messages to the Titanic that there were icebergs in the area. Then the operator of the Titanic heard this message but told Evans to keep out, shut up, I am working Cape Race. The Titanic operator saying he was working Cape Race meant that he was sending passenger messages to Newfoundland and he didn't want to be interrupted. Even hearing this, Evans stayed on the line for a few more minutes and then he turned off his equipment and went to bed. And then a few minutes after he went to bed, the Titanic hit the iceberg and started sending out distress calls, which the Californian did not pick up because Evans was asleep at that point, and the equipment was turned off. Also on page 264, Richard says that Hampton students have a habit of joining ashrams in Nepal. Ashrams are monasteries for Indian religions, not including Buddhism, but for religions like Hinduism. Then on page 267, for our last reference of the chapter, Richard describes the twins arguing and says they tended to sound like Heckle and Jekyll. And Heckle and Jekyll are a pair of cartoon birds They're yellow-billed magpies, and they often just argue and cause problems for each other. I think we made it through that chapter in a decent time, but there are a lot in there, and chapter 6, which we're going to move on to, doesn't have quite as many references. We're actually through more than half of them in the book at this point. And that pretty much wraps up chapter 5 for us. I'm trying to think of additional things that I didn't get to on my first read through. I think one thing that doesn't appear in this chapter, but is good to talk about here, because Sherlock Holmes is mentioned twice, is that original instance where Henry doesn't actually know that the moon landing has happened, or he doesn't believe that the moon landing has happened. He's just so astonished by it. And I think a lot of readers, especially from what I've seen online, think that this is really discordant in Henry's character, but I think that is probably actually a reference to the first Sherlock Holmes short story, in which Sherlock Holmes, it is revealed, does not know that the Earth revolves around the sun. He says that he just doesn't have space in his head for that kind of stuff. It's not important to him. And he's like pretty blown away by that fact as well. And so I think, especially knowing now that Donna Tartt is familiar with Sherlock, she even talks about his brother Mycroft, and so she's at least a bit familiar with the source material. That seems like something that she's just deliberately alluding to in that one. But thank you so much for watching. I'm having a lot of fun making these. I hope that you've learned something from these videos. I know certainly a lot of these references I did not understand on my first read through. They just added a lot of depth to my understanding of this book when I actually took the time and looked them all up. But I hope you had fun. Thank you so much for watching.